The moment Ethan realized who owned the company he'd been begging for a contract with, he went completely still. Not the uncomfortable stillness of embarrassment, the deep, hollow stillness of a man watching everything collapse at once. I watched his face from across that boardroom table, and I thought, 9 years. It took 9 years. But here we are. Let me take you back to where it actually started. I'm Sylvia. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a house I bought myself, in a neighborhood in Kitchener, Ontario, that I chose myself, with a daughter named Rosie, who is the best thing that has ever happened to me. None of that was true 9 years ago. 9 years ago, I was 31, 8 months pregnant, working part-time at an accounting firm on King Street, and I was married to a man named Ethan Marsh, 35, who managed commercial real estate in the Waterloo region. We had been together for 6 years and married for 2. I thought I knew him. I thought I had built something real. I found out I was wrong on a Tuesday in March, which was also the day I went into early labor. The contractions started at work. My colleague drove me to Grand River Hospital because Ethan wasn't answering his phone. I called him 4 times on the way there. He called me back 40 minutes later, after I was already in a hospital gown. And when I told him I was in labor, there was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough for me to understand that something was very wrong. He came. I'll give him that. He arrived at the hospital just before midnight, and he sat in the chair beside my bed, and he held my hand during the worst of it. Our daughter was born at 2:14 in the morning, 4 weeks early, 5 pounds and 3 ounces, and they took her almost immediately because her lungs needed support. I hadn't even held her yet when they wheeled her away in an incubator, and I lay there in that bed, shaking from exhaustion and from the medication and from terror, and Ethan was standing at the window looking at his phone. I asked him to come sit with me. He said he would in a minute. He never did. He stood at that window until a nurse asked him to step out, and then he was just gone, and I was alone in that room, with the sound of the monitors beeping down the hall where my daughter was, and I have never in my life felt so completely abandoned as I did in that specific moment. Rosie spent 11 days in the NICU. I was there every single day, for every feeding, for every weigh-in, every time a doctor came to update me. I learned the name of every nurse on that floor. I learned how to read the monitors. I memorized her numbers the way some people memorize phone numbers, obsessively, because those numbers were the only thing I could control. Ethan came 3 times in those 11 days. 3 times. I stopped counting after the 3rd visit, because counting made me feel something I wasn't ready to feel yet. When Rosie was discharged and we brought her home, I told myself things would settle. New baby, difficult birth, early days. I gave him every excuse I could find. But Ethan was somewhere else, even when he was in the room. He was on his phone constantly, leaving early, coming home late, and when I asked him what was going on, he told me I was being needy. He used that word. I had a 4-week-old baby who had just spent nearly 2 weeks in hospital, and he told me I was being needy. The conversation that ended everything happened on a Sunday afternoon in April, when Rosie was 6 weeks old. I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to eat something, which I hadn't done properly in days, and Ethan came downstairs with a bag over his shoulder. He set it by the front door, and then he came and sat down across from me, like we were about to have a normal conversation. He said he was leaving. I asked him what he meant. He said he meant he was leaving. He'd been unhappy for a long time. The baby had made him realize he didn't want this life. He said, and I want to be precise here because I have never forgotten the exact words. He said, "I'm sorry, Sylvia, but I didn't sign up for this. You and the baby, it's just too much. I don't want to do this." Too much. His daughter was 6 weeks old and she was too much. I didn't cry. I think I was too stunned to cry. I just sat there holding my coffee cup and watching him pick up his bag and walk out my front door, and the sound of it closing behind him was the quietest, most devastating sound I had ever heard. What came out over the following weeks was worse than the leaving. Ethan had been seeing someone for almost a year, a woman named Rebecca, 32, who worked in his office. While I was pregnant, while I was in the hospital, while Rosie was in the NICU, he had been with her. He had spent those 11 days not at the hospital, but with Rebecca. I found this out from his sister, who called me crying, horrified, after Ethan apparently told the family like it was news worth sharing. His mother called me once. She said she was sorry, and that Ethan had always been impulsive, as if that explained it. As if impulsive was the word for what he had done. His lawyer contacted me about a separation agreement within 3 weeks of him leaving. Ethan did not want shared custody. He was willing to pay child support at the minimum provincial guideline, and he wanted, and this is the part that I still find difficult to say out loud, he wanted to be listed as having no custodial involvement, not joint custody with low involvement. Nothing. He wanted to sign away any meaningful role in Rosie's life so that, as his lawyer phrased it, both parties could move forward cleanly. My own lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who I found through a referral and who turned out to be the most unflappable person I have ever met, told me we could push for more. I told her I didn't want to spend whatever money I had fighting a man who was already gone. What I wanted, I said, was to make sure he could never come back and claim any authority over my daughter after choosing to abandon her. Patricia nodded and said she understood, and we drafted the agreement accordingly. Ethan signed it without amendment. He signed away his parental rights to his 6-week-old daughter, and then he and Rebecca moved into a condo in Guelph, and that was, as far as I understood it, the end of Ethan Marsh in my life. I was 31 years old. I had a newborn, a part-time income, a mortgage I could not afford alone, and approximately $4,000 in my personal savings account. I had no family in Ontario. I had grown up in Nova Scotia, moved to Waterloo for university, stayed because of the job, and then because of Ethan. My closest friend, a woman named June, had just moved to Vancouver. My support system was, generously described, thin. I had approximately 1 month before I needed to figure out what I was doing. What I decided to do was not go back to Nova Scotia. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't pride exactly. It was more that I looked at my daughter in her crib, and I thought, I am not going to let this be the story she grows up in. I was not going to be the woman who had to retreat. I was going to build something. I contacted my firm and went back full-time when Rosie was 3 months old. I found a daycare 2 blocks from my office, and I put her on the wait list, and I paid for a temporary home daycare in the meantime with money I did not really have. I worked every hour I could while she slept. I started studying for my CPA designation at night, which I had put off when Ethan and I were trying to have a child, telling myself there was time. There had not been as much time as I thought, so I made time. The child support payments from Ethan came in, inconsistently at first. I reported the missed payments through the Family Responsibility Office. He began to pay on time after that, but the payments were minimum, and Rosie's needs were not minimum, and so the gap between what came in and what went out was a number I kept in my head at all times, the way I had kept her NICU numbers, with a kind of focused anxiety that became its own routine. I passed my CPA exam when Rosie was 14 months old. She came to the celebration dinner at a Thai restaurant on King Street in her stroller and fell asleep in it before the food arrived. And I sat there with a glass of Riesling and thought, okay, that's one thing. Then things began to move, slowly at first, then faster. My firm promoted me to a senior associate role. I built a specialty in corporate tax for small and mid-sized businesses. I was good at it, not just technically, but in the way that mattered, which is that clients trusted me. I listened, I was careful, I did not oversell. I was referred to other clients by those clients, and those clients referred others. And within 3 years, I had a client roster that justified going independent. I incorporated my own practice, Holt Advisory, using my maiden name. In the spring of the year, Rosie turned 4, and I rented a small office on Queen Street and hired 1 part-time bookkeeper and began. The risk was real. I want to be honest about that too. I had a child, a mortgage, and an operating loan from BDC that I had worked very hard to qualify for. Every month in the first year of the practice had at least 1 week where I ran the numbers before bed and felt genuinely sick. But the clients came, and then more clients came, and by the end of year 2, Holt Advisory had 5 full-time employees and a revenue that I would have considered impossible if someone had described it to me on that Sunday in April when Ethan walked out my front door. Rosie started grade 1 at the elementary school 2 streets over. She had her mother's tenacity, her grandmother's red hair, and an absolutely devastating ability to argue a position she believed in. She was, by any measure, thriving. That was what mattered. Everything else was arithmetic. I did not think about Ethan often. There were whole months that went by. He had remarried. Rebecca, the woman from his office, about 2 years after our divorce was finalized, and I had heard from mutual acquaintances that things had not gone well. I did not track it. I did not want to track it. He was not part of our life, and I had accepted that and moved on, which is not the same as healing but is a reasonable substitute, while healing is still in process. Then, in the autumn of Rosie's 9th year, my assistant put a meeting request on my calendar from a commercial real estate consultancy requesting a financial review. The company name was Stonebridge Property Group. I didn't recognize it and asked her to confirm. She confirmed. I took the meeting. He walked in with a colleague, and I watched the moment he registered, who was sitting behind the desk. It was extremely fast. A blink, a recalibration. The professional mask dropping briefly and then being reassembled. He sat down. So did I. His colleague introduced herself and explained that Stonebridge was looking for a new accounting firm to manage their corporate filings and tax planning, as their previous arrangement had ended. I said, "That sounds like something we could discuss." Ethan said very little in that first meeting. His colleague did most of the talking. He looked at me several times in a way that was clearly intended to communicate something. An apology maybe, or an acknowledgement, but I did not engage with it. I was professional. I was thorough. I quoted them a fair rate and said I would send a formal proposal by end of week. After they left, my bookkeeper came into my office and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She said I looked a little pale. I told her I was always a little pale. It was a Nova Scotia thing. That night, after Rosie was in bed, I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I had kept in touch with Patricia over the years, less as a lawyer now, and more as someone I genuinely trusted. I explained the situation. There was a pause, and then she said, "Well, what do you want to do?" I said I'd been thinking about that. Here is what I knew about Ethan Marsh and Stonebridge Property Group by the time of that meeting. I knew because a very good accountant learns to understand the financial landscape of her clients' and industries, and commercial real estate in the Waterloo region is not a large world. I knew that Stonebridge had been overextended since the interest rate increases in 2022 and 2023. I knew they were carrying debt on 3 commercial properties that had not leased at projected rates. I knew they had restructured their financing twice, and that one of their primary lenders, a private credit firm out of Toronto, had placed them on a watch list that had since converted to a formal default notice on a property in Cambridge. I also knew that this private credit firm had 6 months earlier sold a portion of their non-performing loan portfolio to a holding company. I had formed that holding company. I want to be clear about the timeline, because people sometimes assume I planned this from the beginning. I did not. I formed the holding company to acquire distressed commercial debt as an investment strategy, which my financial advisor had recommended, and which made sense for where Holt Advisory's retained earnings were sitting. I had acquired 6 loan files before Ethan's. His was the 7th. I did not know it was his until I did the due diligence review, and his name appeared as a personal guarantor on the note. I sat with that information for 2 weeks. I talked to Patricia. I talked to my financial advisor. I talked to nobody else. Then I decided what I did and did not want. What I did not want: drama, a scene, an opportunity for Ethan to position himself as a victim, a confrontation that Rosie might somehow learn about in the wrong way at the wrong time. What I did want, for him to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that the woman he had called too much, the woman he had walked out on while their daughter was 6 weeks old, was the person who now held the paper on his debt. I sent the meeting request through my holding company's counsel, standard creditor communication. He wouldn't have known who was behind it until he walked in. When I say the color drained from his face, I am not being poetic. I watched it happen. He read the name on the file folder. He looked at me. He read it again. His colleague, who clearly had not been told, looked between us with the particular discomfort of someone who has walked into a situation they do not have the context for. I told him we were there to discuss the terms of his default, that the note carried a personal guarantee bearing his signature, that, as the current holder of that note, my firm had several options available to us, and that I was open to hearing a proposal from him before discussing how to proceed. He said my name, just my name, like a question. I said, "We can do this professionally, Ethan, or we cannot do it professionally, but either way we're going to do it." He asked if we could speak privately. I said no. I said anything he wanted to communicate could be communicated in front of his colleague and my counsel, who was present in the room. What followed was one of the more uncomfortable hours of my professional life, and also one of the more clarifying ones. He made a proposal. It was not a good proposal. We made a counter. Over the following 3 weeks, through lawyers, a repayment and restructuring agreement was reached. The terms were not punishing. I had not designed them to be punishing. I had designed them to be firm. To be exactly as firm as a creditor has every right to be when a borrower has defaulted on a note they personally guaranteed. He paid. Every month he paid. I know because my assistant tracks it. That's not actually the ending, though. The ending happened about 6 weeks after that first meeting, when I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it without listening. But I was on my way out to pick Rosie up from her Wednesday swimming lesson, and I had a few minutes, so I played it. It was Ethan. He had gotten my personal number from somewhere, probably his sister, who had stayed in occasional touch, and he had left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I listened to it once in my car, in the school parking lot. He said he knew he didn't have any right to ask. He said he had thought about Rosie every day. He said he had been wrong, that he understood that was insufficient, that he wasn't asking for anything. He said he just wanted me to know that he knew. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after it ended. Rosie came out with her hair still wet and her swim bag over her shoulder, and she knocked on the car window and made a face at me that was, I'm not going to lie, extremely funny. She climbed in and immediately began telling me about her backstroke and how her coach had said it was improving, and how her friend, Danica, had gotten water up her nose 3 times, and it was very dramatic. I listened and I drove and I thought about that voicemail. I did not call him back. I want to be honest about that too. I thought about it carefully and I made a decision, which is that Rosie's relationship with her father, if she ever chose to have one, was going to be Rosie's decision to make, when she was old enough to make it, not mine to engineer in either direction. I was not going to keep the voicemail from her when she was old enough. I was not going to edit her understanding of who her father was or what he had done. I was going to give her the facts when the time was right and let her decide what she wanted to do with them. What I was also going to do was exactly what I was doing. Drive home, make dinner, help with the maths worksheet that had been sitting on the kitchen table since Monday. Put Rosie to bed and sit for a while in the quiet of a house that was mine, in a life that was mine, that no one had handed me and no one could take. There is a word people use for stories like mine, and the word is resilience, and I have complicated feelings about it. Resilience implies that the difficulty was the point, that the hardship was the thing that made me. I don't think that's quite right. What I think is that Ethan did what he did, and I did what I did, and those are 2 separate facts. He left, I stayed. He gave up, I didn't. The consequences that followed from those choices belong entirely to each of us. He knows that now. I knew it all along. Rosie is 9 years old, and she is the reason I do not regret a single hour of the last 9 years. Not the missed sleep, not the tight months, not the evenings studying while she slept in the next room, not any of it. She knows her mother built something. She has watched me build it. Someday she will understand the whole of what that means. For now, she just knows we're okay. We're better than okay. We always were.